welcome to the online event of the Affiliation of Christian Biologists, or ACB. My name is Brian Greuel, and I am president of the ACB, which is part of the American Scientific Affiliation, or ASA. The ASA is a Christian organization of scientists, engineers, theologians, and individuals in allied fields who engage in respectful dialogue on issues at the interface of faith and science. The ACB focuses especially on topics of interest to biologists, though sometimes, like tonight, we address issues of broader appeal to those in the faith and science communities. Tonight, we are delighted to have Dr. Greg Cootsona as our guest speaker. Greg has a PhD in systematic and philosophical theology and the philosophy of religion from the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California, and an MDiv degree with a New Testament specialization from Princeton Theological Seminary. He is co-director of Science for the Church, a project designed to bring science to Christian congregations as a resource for spiritual growth. He has also directed a variety of projects funded by grants from the John Templeton Foundation, the American Academy of Religion, the Louisville Institute, and the Lilly Endowment. His most recent project, called STEAM, which stands for Science and Theology for Emerging Adult Ministries. That program has offered resources for leaders of emerging adult ministries on how to engage Christian faith with mainstream science. Greg teaches religion, humanities, philosophy, and sociology at California State University in Chico and serves as associate pastor for adult discipleship at Bidwell Presbyterian Church in Chico. He is the author of 8 books, the 3 most recent being Science and Religions in America, A New Look, Negotiating Science and Religion in America, Past, Present, and Future, and Mere Science and Christian Faith, Bridging the Divide with Emerging Adults. Tonight, Greg will lead us in a discussion that is really a follow-up of last month's ASA Winter Symposium. The title of his presentation is Scientists Caught in the Crosshairs of the Culture Wars, Building Trust Between the Faith and Science Communities. Greg, welcome to this ACB event.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you for that introduction. And thank you for the invitation to speak to the group. I'm so excited to do that. And I'm also really excited to have an equal amount of time to talk about the questions and comments that you'll bring. So as Brian mentioned, the topic is Scientists Caught in the Crosshairs of the Culture Wars, Building Trust Between the Science and Faith Communities. And you see my 3 affiliations there, which I'll talk about just a little bit so you can locate me and some of the ways that I come to this conversation. But I want to tell you a little story to start. So you heard about the organization that I co-founded called Science for the Church. And it was started in February, effectively started in February of 2020. Now, I think all of us have a sense of what happened officially in March of 2020. So we were starting this organization, we particularly meaning my colleague, Rick Miller, and I. Drew and I had been on the 2 sides of the John Templeton Foundation projects like Science and Theology for Emerging Adult Ministries, and now had come to collaborate and to say, what if we took this faith and science and congregations topic seriously in an ongoing way that wasn't just funded by grants that have their own cycle? What if we could keep this as an ongoing ministry? So February of 2020, we're like, all right, we are going to do this. We're going to see if we can make this a national outreach, a national ministry. And so we start, and of course, COVID breaks out. So that's the first shift we make. I'm going to avoid the word pivot because the word pivot, in my impression, was a little bit overused in 2020, if not beyond. So we shifted to doing things virtually. Drew is in North Carolina. I'm in Northern California. And actually, we were housed and incubated at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And so we had a kind of, three-prong connection, excuse me. And then we thought, well, this is actually going to work to our, not to our favor, not that we want to benefit of COVID, but the cool thing is the church is going to be asking these questions about COVID and about medical science, and are going to be the church is going to be really, really interested in what medicine and medical science can bring to the conversation. So, as opposed maybe to the past 10 or so years we've been doing this work, or in some ways 20 for me, it's like, wow, there's going to be heightened felt need. And even I'll just say, as you can imagine where I'm going with this, I was on a podcast just as a marker with Mark Laberton, the president of Fuller Seminary at the time. And Mark was asking me, I think it was about April of 2020, well, what do you think about the public perception of scientists, especially the relationship of Christians to scientists? I thought, oh, there's a high value that Christians place on scientists and the U.S. public at large. So it's really interesting. I don't know if you've done podcasts, but interviews, but I watched in the next couple of months for the podcast to come out. I believe it came out in June, maybe July. And it was such a reversal of what Drew and the team at Science for the Church and I expected. Suddenly, science wasn't seen only as an ally, like we tended to see it, or we more than tended to, we generally see it, but was seen as a threat because science had become part of a culture, or maybe put another way, culture and the culture wars had become associated with science. And so that's what I want to talk about today. And here's the key question. How can we go beyond recognizing shared values of science and build shared values between science and faith communities to building trust, especially at a time of deep polarization in our country? So I'm going to tell you my location a little bit, just again, not to give a shameless plug for books and stuff, but so you'll maybe fast track to getting to know me a little bit. Then I want to talk about the culture wars and what it means to be in the crosshairs of the culture wars. Then I want to talk about the threat, not just of the culture wars, but what happens if we don't engage science in our Christian communities. And I want to present to you one way that we have done this work. Really, I've personally done it in my own church ministries for about 20, 25 years. And then we formalized it a few years ago and called it the standard model. I want to then close with how this works out and what to do as in congregations. So I have I think it's about 40 minutes total to do this work. And I think then we'll have question and answer as far as I understand it. But let's move on then. So you heard about Science and Theology for Emerging Adult Ministries. This was a grant-funded project that was housed at Fuller Theological Seminary. And the idea was a strategy that came out of a previous grant called Scientists and Congregations. These are both 3-year grants funded by the John Templeton Foundation. And the idea was, as in the first grant, we're like, well, how can we be more strategic? Well, 18 to 30-year-olds are disaffiliating from the church. They're seeing science and technology as increasingly a part of their lives. Let's focus on ministries relating to science and, to emerging adult ministries like, InterVarsity. ASA was one of the grant recipients. Various churches, Menlo Church down in the Silicon Valley, and there, I think it was 32 total sites. So that's the 2 grant initiatives. That's my second main bullet point. Above that are the 3 locations I serve in. One is Chico State, as Brian mentioned. I'm in the Department of Comparative Religion and Humanities. And about 10 years ago, I was asked to teach science and religion here at Chico State. So that was the particular draw to come to this institution, which is where I am right now in my office. The second, as you heard, is at Bidwell Presbyterian Church, which is literally right next door to California State University, Chico. And I'll tell you a little bit more about it later. But just to say that we have a representation from both Chico State and Butte College here at Bidwell Presbyterian, which is, as I said, like if I could look through the wall, it'd be that way. I mean, it's just right next door to the university, and there's representation of faculty, staff, and students at our church, which is a tremendous thing, including, of course, scientists and people involved in the medical profession and other sciences. And then, as you heard, Science for the Church, or SFTC, is important to connect me with and with this talk. So you'll hear a little bit more about that. And then just in the right-hand corner of your screen, you see Laura and me. That's my wife and I. We're taking a selfie. This was trendy, at least in 2022. We happened to be in Florence at the time teaching. I was teaching a course there, and there we are in a cafe having a good time. So just a little personal note there. These are the books that I've written. You heard the titles already. The InterVarsity book, Mirror Science and Christian Faith, has the most interesting cover. It has gifts on it, which is fun. They're not so biological. They're more maybe more related to astronomy and so on, but they're really fun. So that book came out of the grant Science and Theology for Emerging Adult Ministries. It was designed to encapsulate the topics, to approach those topics, the topics that arose. What are the main topics, in other words, that 18 to 30-year-olds are looking at when they engage with science and technology? It's probably worth saying that the demographic that is part of STEAM, part of this book, is really important to me. I grew up in a home that would be considered today a home of nuns. We had no religious affiliation to speak of. Our court philosopher was Ayn Rand, who wrote the books on objectivism and the virtue of selfishness. So faith, really of any kind, wasn't much of an option to me. I did get a foray into hearing about the Christian faith from some friends I knew, but particularly by reading the work of C.S. Lewis and Mere Christianity when I was a junior in high school. That incubated some questions and some thoughts that then, and this could sound like a punchline, that then when I went to Berkeley, UC Berkeley, I became a Christian. And it was partly the seeds that were sown by Lewis and others. So that's why this book and why this demographic is so important to me. More recently, because of my location in a religious studies department, I have written a couple of books. One to the right, Negotiating Science and Religion, is a history of science and religion in our country from basically the founding, the colonial period to the present, make some final observations for the future. And then the particular book that I use in my class in a multi-religious context is Science and Religions in America, which looks at 8 different religious traditions, including, by the way, the spiritual but not religious. So those are the books that inform what I do and might be relevant to question and answer later. I mentioned Science for the Church. You can see a little bit of our team there. Goofy, Heather Mickelwright. There I am. Edgardo Rosado with the huge piece of chess, and then Drew Rick Miller. We are gathering together. I think it was in some mall. I can't even remember the state it was in. I think it was Virginia. Anyway, we were gathering together. So we are seeking in this group, in this organization, to cultivate a church that's stronger through meaningful dialogue with science. And we've worked with about 100 congregations. So that flows into this conversation today about the culture wars. And it means that my unit of measure, as it were, will be congregations. I'm not talking about the U.S. as a whole. I'm not talking about the world. I'm trying to focus on how does the relationship, and sometimes the tensive and conflictual relationship between science and religion and Christian faith particularly, play out in Christian congregations. And by the way, that could include, churches as well as, university groups or campus crusade groups or chaplaincies. So let me look at one particular flashpoint. And I'm trying to not just raise up our anxiety, get our cortisol levels and vasopressin just throbbing through us right now. Um, but I think it's important to name probably the biggest issue for biologists, which is the theory of evolution, biological evolution, and how that itself has been part of the polarization of our country. So on the way there, I do want to just talk about that first bullet point for a minute. That my academic study, particularly, I'm like I teach classes in humanities and the emergence of science and technology from the Renaissance and the scientific revolution to the present, especially the European scientific revolution. When I wrote this book about other religious traditions and other cultural contexts, it became more and more clear that science is not acultural. Now, that's a double negative, but I wanted to be a little bit restrained. But I would even go further and say, when you think of, for example, the eugenics emergence from about 1880 to about 1930 at least, you see how much science was captivated by cultural issues. And what we call science is particularly formed by modern science in Europe and the United States. So we can't avoid the fact that science has cultural elements. Now, science has great processes and procedures and methods to sort out those cultural biases, but it still plays in and is formed by the cultures in which it's formed, which it's embedded. So, evolutionary science. You see the graphic to the left. Uh, this is by Pew, and this is old, and this is purposefully old, between 2009 and 2013. And you see that Republicans in that time have moved from a majority position, accepting the idea that we have humans and other living things have evolved over time, to a minority position from 54% to 43%, accepting that designation. Democrats and independents are approximately two-thirds, and that's remained relatively stable. A more recent study from 2021 has found that 34% of conservative Republicans accepted evolution at that time, compared to 83% of liberal Democrats. Now, let me be clear. I'm not doing this to make Republicans the problem or make Democrats the solution. What I am doing is saying the church tends to skew toward representation in the Republican Party and right-leaning politics. And so we have to realize, if we're going to do this work of connecting faith and science, that it exists within this cultural framework. And that when people hear the word evolution and they're a biologist, or they have been long enough in conversations like I have been with scientists and evolutionary scientists and so on, people don't hear, genetic distribution and studies of primates and other living organisms and the measured work of science. They hear something that sounds often anti-Christian and connected with values they do not share. So that's a first realization. Maybe many of you just take that in immediately. It actually took me a while, even though I don't come at this as primarily as a trained scientist, to recognize that, because I have such a positive view of what can be learned from evolutionary science. Here's a couple stories. Let me make sure I have enough time I'll do as much as I can, and I want to make sure I move through my presentation. But the first two are difficult. One is my friend Grant, who's a biologist, actually became a Christian while studying biology in graduate school, when he realized the intricacy of nature that was demonstrated through the process of evolution. So he decided, after writing a book and studying this work of how to bring together science and his evangelical Christian faith, to talk with his pastors, to have an ongoing weekly study group with young adults, to demonstrate, among other things, but what his research indicated about evolution in science, and his faith, and how those connected and could go together. And he said they all shook their head, yes, I see what you're talking about. I understand. I might even agree. But when it came to changing a single sermon, or perhaps even a conviction about the process of evolution as significant for understanding the world and how the world relates to the scripture. He says there really was no change. And he walked away from that church. Not didn't walk away from it. He actually ended up moving, but when he moved, he was disappointed that his specialization as a scientist was so disregarded. The second is I did a series of interviews as a part of my work for the book Mere Science and Christian Faith, and as a part of Science and Theology for Emerging Adult Ministries. So go back a step. We did some quantitative research for STEAM, which is collected in a couple papers that at least one paper that I've published. But Elaine Howard Eklund, who's a good friend and who's an advisor, I know spoke last month. She always said, combine quantitative and qualitative. So I've done these hour-long interviews based on Christian Smith and his team's research on faith and on religion and science. And one of these interviews, I talked with a student who went to a parochial school, and let's call her Chris. Chris was at this school, and by the way, this is not an anti-Catholic thing. It's just where she went to school, that it was a Christian school, and she kept asking questions of different sorts about faith, about about science, about evolution, about how you put together the doctrine of creation with evolutionary science and the Big Bang. And she and her parents, insofar as I remember this story and have recorded it correctly, were taken into the principal's office or the equivalent, and they said, "Your daughter asked too many questions. Basically, if you keep asking questions, you will be asked to leave the school." So that divide between a community of scientists, which I've generally found to be very creative and curious. I think this is one of Elaine's values she was talking about last time. And sometimes the religious community that can feel like, well, we've already battened down the hatches on what we believe, so don't ask too many questions. One final story, just so you know it's not all bad news. One of our new board members is just a tremendous scientist, Jessica Moorman. You might know her from the Evangelical Environmental Network. And Jessica, when she was a senior growing up in rural/suburban Tennessee, was hearing God tell her or guide her to study geology. And so she was in a discernment process on the way to college, and she was talking with her youth pastor, and her youth pastor said, "Jessica, I think that's great. Don't you know I'm a geologist?" I just love that. I just love the fact that, science is underrepresented among pastors, but here is a scientist who's making such a difference in creation care and other parts of our faith science connection, and how things can go right as well within places where, as far as Jessica told me, the culture wars can be very present in rural, suburban Tennessee. All right, here's the next part. What happens if we are involved in the culture wars? What happens if we get scared? What happens if we don't engage science? What's the loss? Like, the first loss is we lose a great heritage as Christians. The heritage of the European scientific revolution and places where science has flourished in other parts of the country with the world with the Christian community. I remember when I interviewed John Lennox about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, the mathematician and apologist from Cambridge, philosopher of science. And John, I feel like I know him, even though we don't know each other well, but he's so winsome. He said, Greg, science is a gift that the church has given to the world. Oh my goodness. I want to give witness to that, as we say in the church. Like, let's not lose that heritage. Let's not sell our birthright. We need to keep forward how science is such a part of what we do. The second thing is, this is going to sound a little bit market driven, but I think we lose our competitive advantage. If we in congregations that have trained scientists like yourselves don't engage science, we will lose our competitive advantage, which leads me to the next slide. So the nuns, religion, and science. Let me take one sip here. As I said, there was a real motivation for science and theology for emerging adult ministries. And that motivation was that 40% or about 40% of those under 30 check the box, no religious affiliation or none of the above when asked about what is their affiliation. So we have to we will do well to create churches where we address science because these are topics, science and technological topics that are part of this younger demographic. And there's a perception that the church dismisses science. This is shorthand for one of the top 6 reasons that the Barna group found that emerging adults are walking in the doors of the church and walking in the front door and walking out the back door is that one of the top 6 reasons is that the church is seen as anti-science. I think it's 49%, so almost half of church-going youth, that's the emphasis, believe that their church presents defective science. And so I can tell you because you probably know it if you're in if you've had these kind of conversations. So maybe I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but I continually in my classes ask, I teach about 200 or 300 students a year, how do they view science and religion? And this is a very common refrain. I had some religious training, but when I heard about what it taught scientifically, I went and I studied science or took a few science classes, and there was no connection between the two. So I decided if it's choice between religion and science, between Christianity and science particularly, I'm going to choose science. So what is our strategy for engagement? And here again, I'm going to be focusing on the positive because I imagine that we all feel the culture wars strongly. So I believe that our strategy for engagement is connecting with the great scientists that we have in our congregation. And I'm going to tell you in a minute why I don't think they need to be scientists that wear a lab coat, scientists that teach at elite institutions, although those are great, and I have friends in those worlds. But they can be the biology teacher at our local high school. They can be the physician at our hospital nearby. They can be the community college teacher in biology. And what scientists do is they unfold the beautiful intricacy of creation that leads us to appreciate the creator. There are 2 people that I consider friends that help me to particularly understand this. Jeff Harden, who is at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and Jennifer Wiseman, who is a leading astronomer, is at NASA, and both have talked about how their work can be worship. Their work of science can be worship. I then look at the great mentor for me in all things Christian, but especially relating toward intellectual pursuits, C.S. Lewis, who's had that great line, one's mind runs back up the sunbeam to the sun. One's mind runs back up the sunbeam to the sun. It's classic Lewis beauty and so much contained in there. So if you're familiar with the walk that Lewis took in which he became a Christian in September of 1931, it was Addison's Walk right near his buildings, the so-called new buildings, which I believe were built in 1730. It's 1730 or 1830. Check my facts. You can put that in the chat. At Oxford, at Magdalen College, he was walking with his friends Dyson and Tolkien, and he grasped that the fulfillment of his desire in myths, at that point, great stories, was in Christ, the true myth that became fact. Similarly, Lewis pointed out that's beyond what we see in this world, the sunbeam, there's a sun. Beyond the gifts of creation, there's a creator. And so this image of Addison's Walk always reminds me of that. I just thought for a moment we'll get away from the other slides and just take in a slide of this gorgeous creation that God our Creator has made, and why we want to listen to poets, even to theologians, to friends, but to our scientists as well, to help us understand the complexity, beauty, and sometimes even the questions that nature brings to us. So, what is the impact? I want to go back to this one more time. We live in a world defined by science and technology, and sometimes it's hard to see how and where our faith fits. And the amazing discovery is that science, for many, probably not for that many in this particular conversation, but for many people in our churches, is that science and technology can dramatically enhance our faith. Sorry, it skipped, and we, as I said, in Science for the Church, have done some work with that. I'm only speaking from this because this is something that has I've worked a lot with. So it's one way of framing this. So don't think I hope I'm not inferring that I'm presenting this as the only way to do it. But we have a method called the standard model. Of course, this is homage to the model in physics. And the standard model is pairing a scientist or scientists with a pastor or leaders in a church congregation to understand one another and to learn from one another. So we have a 6-step guide that you can find on our website, scienceforthechurch.org, that walks you through this. It's not a long piece. It's 10, 15 pages. And we found that what's happened when churches have engaged between scientists and pastors, although simplified to that, is they've grown in their reputation, they've instilled confidence, they've increased user involvement, and they've energized ministry leaders. And again, I'm trying to point out what happens when we cower because of the culture wars and don't engage, and what the benefits of engaging are. In a survey we did after one of our grant projects, we asked members of the congregation, not only did they grow in their insights in science, and of course that was true. They grew in their insights of science. That's just basic. I mean, it's great that they did, right? But we also asked, what was the effect on your faith? And 85% of the congregational members we surveyed said they grew in their faith as a result of engaging science. Now, if I make it evangelical for you for just a minute, I learned once that Christ is Lord at all. If he isn't Lord of all, then he's not Lord at all. If he's not Lord of all, then he's not Lord at all. And once we begin to bring more of our lives to Jesus, we find that he grows. He grows, and our faith grows along with him. To quote St. Clive Staples Lewis, who I've given sainthood in my own pantheon, well, not pantheon, but my own hagiography. In the Chronicles of Narnia, I don't know if you know that part, if you know that set of books, but the Chronicles of Narnia, the children wonder why Aslan seems to be getting bigger. And Aslan says, I'm not getting bigger. It's just that you see me as getting bigger. I'm paraphrasing. I'm sure Lewis said it better, but that's the point. As we bring science, as we bring nature, as we bring the book of nature to our faith, we see God growing. And so that's significant, in my opinion. Let me just see. I think I have a few more minutes. Flag me if I don't, Bruce. But I wanted to offer a couple of examples. I have 4. We'll see which ones I feel led to talk about. And then I want to close with a couple of the how and the what. So, yeah, I'll make one personal. So St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church in Houston, where Elaine Howard Eklund is a member, and my good friend Jeff Smith is pastor, they put together a talk on evolution and the Christian faith, that is, not the Christian, by Kenneth Miller, many of you know, the noted Brown biologist. It proved to be a major outreach in the community. So that's the first thing. When we engage, we may be stepping on or grabbing the third rail, but there's also a positive, I think, resonance often. I preached the next day on Make Me an Instrument of Your Peace, which called participants to reconcile faith and science. in our lives, not least of which is because our kids are engaging in science. 52% of youth group teens aspire to science related careers like biology, chemistry, engineering, technology, etc. So my own daughter had just started a program at Barnard College of Columbia University in neuroscience and behavior. And you can imagine that I preached with deep conviction. I would love to talk with you about my friend and colleague, another grant recipient, um, Carl Hoffman, and the work he's done at in Boulder, Colorado, with people like Philip Yancey and Dr. Harold Koenig. Um, I can tell you about also Bidwell Presbyterian Church in our annual conference, as well as the Chico Triad, which is on philosophy, theology, and science that meets monthly and talks about faith and science issues. And my own work currently with the neuroscientists. We're working and collaborating on classes and experiences to understand love from neuroscience and from the scripture. We call it neurobiblical approaches to love. But I'll close with this example from this section. I love this story from a smaller PCUSA congregation in Randolph, New York, which was also a Scientists and Congregations congregation. They were at a event co-sponsored with Fuller Seminary called Talk of God, Talk of Science. So we interviewed the pastor, Leslie, and the scientist, Ruth, and they commented that when they started talking science, the men showed up, who make up in most PCUSA congregations about a third. And it's this basic idea of trust. Trust is really the key thing we're talking about here. There's been a deep level of mistrust, and the polarization is making it worse. But when we trust, when we say, oh, that's Marie, she taught my kids, she's not going to do anything anti-Christian in teaching about science, all of a sudden our guard is let down. We may not be ultimately convinced, but we will be able to engage in the conversation. I want to make one sidebar comment, which I didn't include in any bullet points, but our time in COVID, and I'm fully supportive of the COVID protocols and the social isolation, et cetera, et cetera. So this is not a negative on those things, but it did cause us to become lonely, and it caused us to become more polarized. And this is not my own insight, but it's the insight I've learned, because one of the things that happens in social media interactions is we get drawn to people who have extreme views that are closer to our extreme views. Now, that can be very simple. It could be, I love the Yamaha recording custom drum set in black piano finish. I'm a drummer. So if I want to talk with other people who love the Yamaha recording custom drum set, I can get to find probably 300 people through social media. That's a kind of banal example. But I feel very bonded to those people, like closely bonded, much more kind of unusually bonded. And COVID, I think, both separated us, the COVID protocols, but also bonded us with people with extreme views. And we can see how the increase in extreme views, polarization, and all the isms like racism and militarism, etc., were heightened during those times. They weren't created by those times, but they were certainly heightened, and we're still living in that. So here's some ideas for how to connect people: a book club, a Sunday school class, a youth or college program, a worship service. Currently, our church has just received a grant from the Calvin Institute on Worship to see how we can bring the insights of science to preaching, psychology, pedagogy, neuroscience to preaching and to worship. So that's one of those examples. You could do a sermon series on creation care or the beauty of nature. You could do an event or lecture, and I'd be happy to talk about that. Theology on tap, go off campus, find a place to do this work. We have there's like the university's all around me. The church is that way. And then that way is a great beer place called the Madison Bear Garden. And I once ran a class there on an upper room where people weren't necessarily drinking beer, but it was just a different environment to engage these topics. So taking it outside is always good, especially for those not religiously affiliating. Maybe a science fair would be good. I have a friend who runs a part of VBX or VBS, Vacation Bible School, Vacation Bible Experience. He runs a science component of that time. Let me see where we are. Yeah, okay. So how this works out and the what, the how first. As Elaine said in her presentation, this is not entirely about knowledge. It's about emotions and relationships. The work of Jonathan Haidt, if you know his work, the social psychologist, has helped me to be sensitized to the importance of emotions. The recent work that I've been doing in terms of research has indicated that reason and emotion really aren't separated in the cognitive in our neuroscientific and cognitive work. So emotion and thinking always go together. The longer I've done this work with science and faith as a pastor, the longer I've seen resistance and seen engagement, I realize it's not just about thoughts and ideas. It's about, what does this mean? When somebody tells you that, let's say that I was this thing about this earlier, that there's no Adam and Eve because of evolutionary science, and we can have a great conversation about that if you want, whether that's true or not because of evolutionary science. If you hear that, I don't think most people care about Adam and Eve particularly, but they care about, what does that mean about God making me in the image of God? It becomes a very personal thing. And can I trust that Bible, which seems to say God made me in the divine image? Can I trust that Bible when I am depressed and need help, or my marriage is falling apart? That, I think, is the emotional issue. The valence, emotional valence, as my friend Dr. Leonard Matheson, the neuroscientist, has taught me. Emotional valence is important for our thoughts. As I mentioned earlier, we trust people we know. I've had large scale events with national level speakers who are friends, like Carl Giberson and Robert John Russell and others. And at those events, Gary, a biologist, and Rick, a philosopher from our local community college, had, I'm going to say it, had better buy-in because they knew those people. There was a connection with them. I'm just repeating what I said earlier. Trust is so important. And then finally, just a kind of, I don't know, reality check. Whereas maybe on the evangelical side of the world, there's more about problems with subscribing to science, engaging science. In the mainline world, what I hear from mainline Christians, mainline Jews actually too, Reformed Jews, for example, the question is, yeah, we subscribe to science, but why should I care about faith at all? Why should I pick faith as a topic to worry about? We need to bring these two together. And as Francis Collins, who I understand will be speaking next month, I think it is, has stated so well, and that's always fun to see a younger Francis Collins. One of the greatest tragedies of our time is this impression that has been created that science and religion have been at war. So yes, so I want to make sure I know where I'm going. Got one last story for you, one last set of points, and we'll go to discussion. So queue up those questions, put them in the chat if you'd like. So in this book, Mere Science and Christian Faith, one of the last examples I give is from Dave. At the time was an emerging adult in his late 20s. He said he was blessed with great public education. And in the first grade, he had his first science class, and his interest grew throughout elementary school. In middle school, the classes grew more difficult. And in high school, the studies went deeper, focusing on biology, chemistry, physics, and Earth space. Earth space. I wonder what that means exactly. Sometimes you read your own words, you're not sure, but Earth and space, I guess. Quote, all the time my faith in Jesus was developing and my heart was yearning to love him and be his. Dave continues, as both my faith and science studies merged, however, I grew increasingly silent. By high school, I wasn't sure how the two worked together or if they worked together at all. I'll never forget the day I spoke up in science class. We had a new teacher, 100% Italian, with a thick accent and brilliant mind. She referred to the Big Bang without the word theory. One day I politely raised my hand and asked, isn't the Big Bang still in fact a theory? By which, of course, Dave meant conjecture. You could hear a pin drop, he said. From the moment on, she referred to the Big Bang as theory. However, I began to naively discard science in the name of faith. Months later, Dave went to a worship concert with Matt Redman, and this redirected his mindset. The theme of the concert was How Great is Our God. Midway through the concert, speaker, author, and pastor Louis Giglio took the stage. He shared scriptures and pictures of the universe and communicated how scientific insights revealed how grand, wonderful, and how big God really is. By the way, I believe that in some of those talks, he quotes Jennifer Wiseman, if I'm not mistaken. Giglio told us that while the moon and the sun appear the same size, the sun is actually 400 times larger. Yet it appears the same as the moon because it is also 400 times farther away. If Earth were a golf ball, the sun would be 15 feet high. He also described a star named Betelgeuse, which is 427 light years away and twice the size of the Earth's orbit around the sun. If the Earth were a golf ball, we could fill the Superdome 3,000 times. And he concludes with this. It was one of those perfect nights where I fell in love with God all over again. Even more important, I no longer viewed the insights of science as an enemy or a conflict for my faith. For the first time, the insights of modern science helped me to know my God better. How great indeed is our God when we bring the insights of science and the insights of Scripture together. So trusted voices are important. We engage people, not with arguments and abstraction, but we engage people with arguments. There's me talking with my friend, biologist Gary Fugel, at a recent event. We used to do conversations at Chico State as well. Of course, Francis Collins, that was the first time I met him personally. He's been such a mentor to me of bringing together a trusted voice with science and Christian faith. I have on there where you can email me if you have any questions or want some resources. The Science for the Church website. I'm Greg at Science for the Church, one big kind of word, .org, Greg at scienceforthechurch.org. So my hope in what I've shared is that you've seen the way that science and faith can fit together and form something really beautiful, and that there's a reason to do it, even when we believe that and are caught in the crosshairs of the culture wars, because there's something we don't want to miss letting our friends and the people in the pews around us see that the God we know is the God of both the greatness of creation and the power and the wonder of redemption. That's why we stick in the crosshairs and seek to make a difference. Thanks for letting me address you tonight, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you all for joining us for this presentation of the Affiliation of Christian Biologists. Our next virtual event will be on March 5th, just 2 weeks from now. We will be hosting Dr. Francis Collins, a physician and geneticist known for his landmark discoveries of disease genes, for spearheading the Human Genome Project, for championing the harmony between faith and science, and for his 12 years of leadership of the National Institutes of Health under 3 U.S. presidents. Dr. Collins will tell us about the latest advances in using personal genomic information for precision health initiatives, and how we, as members of the Christian and scientific communities, can support these efforts. If you are interested in getting more information about the Affiliation of Christian Biologists or its parent organization, the American Scientific Affiliation, I would invite you to send an email request to asa@asa3.org. Again, that's asa@asa3, that's the number 3.org. So long, and have a great evening.